Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here. Um, we are going to talk a little bit about taxes, revenue, budget, the fun intersection thereof, and how we create a fairer budget with fairer taxes. Um, First thing to start off with our grounding is, why do we even care about taxes in the first place? Most of us, when we get, our paycheck, we feel this little penguin vibe here of like, stop it, government, you're taking my money. This is very sad. But in an ideal world, our tax dollars are going to invest in the critical needs of our neighbors, our communities, our coalition priorities that we have in the city. And so that the tax dollars that we collectively contribute are what enable us to make sure that our budget and our public investments can actually lift up the kids and families that we advocate for. Um, DC does have to have a balanced budget every year. That means that the money that we take in has to match with the money that is going out and that we are spending. We cannot go into any kind of deficit or overspending. Um, we can talk more about that later if you're interested, but most important thing to know is just that we have to have a balanced budget, which means that we need to have enough revenue and enough of a tax base in order um, to meet the obligations that we have to our city, um, and our safety net, our investments in kids, et cetera. Because all of that means how much we can spend on kids and families. Um, you can skip to the next slide. Our first of our pie charts. Um, Before we talk about putting more money into the budget, I do want to make sure folks understand where it is that our money comes from. So this is simply a screenshot of a pie chart that the CFO, the Chief Financial Officer for the city, created for us in this year's FY27 budget books. It breaks down the distribution of revenue sources that make up our overall $21.3 billion budget for the district. You can see the largest section at the bottom is local revenue. That's local tax dollars is what that means, at 11.3 billion. 11.8 billion, I can read. Um, we also get some money from federal grants and federal payments. There are some private grants and donations. There's special purpose and enterprise revenue. I don't really know what those are. I know it's something that has to do with like unemployment insurance and some other special dedicated things. For the most part, we don't need to know. The most important thing to understand is that very, very large chunk of local tax dollars. Um, uh, our local dollars, us DC residents, DC businesses, property owners, et cetera, we are the ones who pay for DC's budget for the investments that we make into our city. Um, Overwhelmingly, I think there is a pretty serious misconception about, oh, well, it's DC, you get federal money and that's how things are funded. No, we'll talk about that more in a second. Um, but local dollars is where the vast majority of our budget comes from. And that is especially true when we look at what's called the operating part of our DC budget. That's like what we spend on our school systems, our out of school time programs, our early education, our homeless services, uh, et cetera, like things that we are actually spending money on every year compared to um, capital building projects, or things that we have to pay back, like debt financing stuff. Uh, the local dollars is what makes up the bulk of how we actually operationalize our budget. And if we go to our next slide, we're going to dive down a little bit deeper into where exactly those local dollars, tax dollars, are coming from. Again, screenshot from the CFO's budget book for FY27 of the distribution here that we're looking at. The majority, not majority, 41.4. Clearly, we need some ranked choice voting to rearrange here, but 41.4% of our local dollars comes from income tax. That's the tax that we spent or that we pay out of our regular paychecks into the district. Some of our income tax goes to the district, some of it goes to federal. This is just the like what goes to the DC component. The next largest chunk is the property tax component. It's that purple wedge on the pie. We also have sales tax. We have some little mini smidgens of lottery taxes. I don't really know what gross receipts taxes are. Again, little mini things. The most important thing to understand out of this chart is income tax, property tax, sales tax. Those are the three pillars right now of uh, our local tax base. I'm looking at this to see if there's like a business tax thing here, and there isn't. So I'm not sure where that is, but income tax may also reflect some of the business taxes that are paid. Property tax reflects both personal and like residential and commercial property tax together. Moving on to the next slide, and going back to the federal dollars, we do get a significant amount of money from the federal government. That's all well and good and lovely. That $6 billion is very helpful. And it is not any different than any other state would get. Every state gets federal dollars for programs like Medicaid. That is the vast majority of that first bar that you see in the Department of Healthcare Finance is Medicaid dollars that we are receiving federal funding for. We also get a significant amount of money for supplemental nutrition, the SNAP program, just like every other state. We get TANF dollars, just like every other state. Every state gets some money from the federal government for the child care subsidy program. Some of homeless services are funded through federal grants. Education programs, special education, those all again get federal dollars that are coming into the states. So anything that we are getting as federal tax dollars and grants and payments is just the normal part of being any other state. The district is not getting special treatment. It is fair treatment. And frankly, we actually get sort of screwed over by the federal government because they have so much property in the city that we cannot tax. That means that's foregone revenue that we can't collect on in terms of what we could otherwise be charging property taxes for. So in case anyone of your non-DC friends ever ask or say that you have it easy in DC, we don't lie. Don't let them get away with that. Okay, enough of my pet peeve on that part. Moving on. Yes, we have a very large budget. $21.3 billion is a lot of money. A lot of good can be done with that. And it is still not meeting the needs of the city. There are a number of reasons for that, that the economists at the CFO office have speculated. There are reasons that I'm sure we don't fully know why. There's lots of talk right now in like the council, in the auditor's office, in the mayor's office of like government waste and like, we need to spend more efficiently. Sure, that's part of it, always is going to be. But that's not the real reason that we're not keeping pace to meeting needs. We have had slower revenue growth in recent years. And that means that the revenue that we are taking in from our tax base is not keeping pace with like the cost of doing business. Everything is getting more expensive in the city, as it does every year. Labor costs go up, supply costs go up, the money we spend on contracts, all of that goes up, and that is going up faster than our revenue growth has been going up. Um, we do have some depressed trends around property tax and like commercial property tax in particular, because there is still fairly high vacancy as a result of the pandemic. Um, we're also seeing our sales tax is mostly rebounded, but we also are not seeing the same level of commercial sales activity as we were pre-pandemic, of people going out and eating at lunch or staying in the city and going out to happy hour or other entertainment. So there are still impacts from the pandemic that are driving this. Um, and then the other influence of late is the impact of the Doge economy and federal workers being laid off, so higher unemployment, lower income tax coming in. But it's not just the federal government layoffs, it's everything that is, related around that, because there's so many other contracts, consultants, like the number of industries that revolve around federal government and federal operations, or businesses that, like previously catered to the very many staff from USAID that worked at the like Reagan building who no longer do. All of that is driving some of these slower revenue growths that we're seeing, which is creating more pressure on our budget. So I think it's helpful to understand that context that the chief financial officer often talks about and presents to the council. But the other reason that doesn't get talked about enough, unless it's by us brilliant advocates, is that there are a lot of tax loopholes that allow certain individuals and corporations to get away with not paying their fair share into our city, and that we haven't modernized our tax system, I think, since like 2010. We haven't done like major reforms to it. And we have a different, operating economy than we did pre-pandemic. It is time for an update. It's time for reevaluating what makes sense, who has the ability to pay, how much do they need to pay, and how are we making sure that our taxes are truly fair and equitable for everybody, and so that we can fully meet the needs in our city. So that's what we're going to dive into. Um, DC does have a very, very progressive income tax threshold. A progressive tax structure means that um, folks with the lowest incomes pay the lowest or nothing in, depending on what their income is, pay the lowest in income tax. And the people with the highest incomes pay the highest percentage of income tax. But income tax is not the only thing we look at when we think about taxes and what people are contributing. It is also their like broader share of property tax, whether that's through ownership or rental. It is also through their contribution sales tax, taxes on additional assets and wealth. Um, and by and large, when you look at somebody's, household budget, lower income families and middle income families are paying more in taxes, in local taxes, than the highest income individuals in the city. The top 5% have a lower tax burden or a lower tax contribution rate than our middle income families, which means that our overall tax system is not actually progressive. It is relatively flat. I wouldn't call it quite regressive, but it's relatively flat. And we should have a more progressive tax system, because those at the top end have the most ability to pay. And what we've also seen in recent years is the revenue growth is slower overall. The place that revenue growth is growing is among our highest wealth holding individuals through their passive income, not necessarily their income paycheck, but like passive income, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Um, So, restructuring our tax code means helping to make sure that the scales are more progressive, so that our highest income individuals are paying more proportionally relative to their ability to pay than our middle and lower income families. And when you look at the distribution of DC households, you will also see a very direct correlation between our highest income and our highest wealth households being overwhelmingly white households in the district, and our lowest income households being overwhelmingly Black. And so when we can help to make the tax code fairer, we can also help to address racial equity because we can take some of that, you know, high income white wealth, a lot of it being generational wealth, and reinvest that into programs and services that help to lift up families that are struggling the most to help them get a fair shot at success and opportunity. So talking about tax equity or yeah, tax inequality is also talking about racial equity and racial equality in the city. And I'm sure DCFPI has many more graphics on all of that that we can send out later. Um, so that is what we are here to do, is to talk about how we can work together and make taxes fairer. Um, Another important thing to know about when you talk about taxes is that you do not have to be an expert to talk about taxes, tax policy, revenue policy. You just have to care. You just have to care enough that like our system is not fully fair, it's not fully equitable, and we're not meeting enough of our community's needs. So I want to dispel any anxiety that folks have about having these conversations with elected officials. You don't need to be an expert. You just have to like say, this is what I believe in. And sorry, Ariana, you can go to the next slide. You don't have to know every single detail about a tax policy in order to talk about it. Most elected officials also don't know the tax details, or they'll get it wrong. So there's no pressure for you to get it completely right. And there's also no right answer for how and where to spend new revenue. Every person, every coalition, every organization is going to have different priorities. There are so many needs in this city. There's no shortage of where money could be spent. Now, there might be a wrong answer on where to spend new revenue. Like, yes, the commanders won the ranked choice voting thingy, but like, it's probably a wrong answer to invest more money in the commanders, in my humble opinion. But there's no right answer. So those are important things to know and keep in mind to empower yourselves to talk about revenue and the need to raise taxes, right size our tax base, and create a more equitable tax system. Uh, you have everything you need to know just by caring enough to say to do it. You don't have to be the experts in the details. But we will get into a little bit of the details. So in this current budget climate and this budget season, there are two main revenue ideas that are being floated forward, primarily through the Just Recovery Coalition, which is a coalition of organizations like DC Action, fighting for a more equitable tax code and more revenue to invest in our families and communities. These are also backed up by our friends at the DC Fiscal Policy Institute. They're an anchor organization of our Under Three Coalition, and they do a lot of the tax policy research in the city about how to create a more equitable tax code. Some of these ideas as well were vetted by the recently convened Tax Revision Commission. This was convened 2022, maybe earlier. They were supposed to talk about looking at how to make our tax code more resilient, fairer, more equitable, what needs to be modernized. And they had a lot of good conversations. And then they decombobulated themselves and put forward no official recommendations to the council, which was their mandate of like how to modernize and update our tax system for the good of the city. But these ideas were discussed, vetted, researched by the Tax Revision Commission. So in addition to our friends at DC FPI have been doing a lot of research, there was also independent research conducted by the Chief Financial Officer's office on portions of these recommendations. The first one that many, but not all, in the Tax Revision Commission thought would be a potentially good idea is something called a business activity tax. Um, right now, uh, if you are like a registered business entity in the district, like a corporate franchise, you pay a certain business tax into the city. But there are a number of entities that are structured as partnerships, which effectively is like, you know, you're a partial owner, you're a self-employed business person, that do not pay taxes into the district unless that owner is a resident of the district. So that is firms like law firms, lobbyist firms, consulting, PR firms, accounting agencies, uh, mostly things that are structured as an LLC or partnership, sometimes S corps. Um, and if those partners, if those business owners do not live in the district, we cannot tax them. That goes back to a home rule prohibition on taxing income from outside of district residents. It's called the commuter tax prohibition. We do not tax any income of folks who do not live in the district. So if you work for DC Action, for example, we are a DC-based business, um, and you live in Maryland, you are paying your income taxes into Maryland. If you live in DC, you pay your income taxes into DC. Now, if DC Action was instead New York Action, and we had our headquarters in New York, and somebody lived in New Jersey but worked for the organization in New York, they would pay their income taxes into New York because that is where the income is coming from. That's where their business and their employment is. They would not be paying income taxes into New Jersey where they live. So we are unique and distinct in that way, that we cannot tax the income of non-residents of the city. And because the way that these businesses are structured is that it function, their business structure functions as personal income as opposed to business income, we cannot tax them. And so a lot of these very well-to-do law firms and other partnerships, their owners are paying taxes into Maryland and Virginia for the most part, maybe West Virginia, maybe Delaware they commute from, but they're not paying it into the district. And by looking at a business activity tax, which assesses a business's like growth, gross, GROSS, uh, profits and activity compared to what their expenses are for the year, by taxing the activity that is happening within the business structure, we can capture that portion of their activity as a form of tax, of a business tax, as opposed to it being considered an income tax. A very small percentage, like a 2% business activity tax, is estimated to raise about $500 million for the city each year. Now, some of that could be offset with lowering other business taxes in the city, the corporate franchise tax, unincorporated business tax, there's payroll taxes. There are other ways to like offset some of that, but it's pretty impressive that we have enough of these LLC partnership type entities that such a small, percentage rate could raise 500 million. And one of the things that I really like about the business activity tax as well is that, we're not taking, like, we're not taking someone's tax break or tax giveaway, from their own earnings. Like they're still paying, effectively, like, as an individual, they're still paying the same amount, whether it's to Maryland or to DC, because they can claim a credit in their income tax against what they pay in business taxes to DC. So we're not actually creating any additional tax burden on, these law partners or accounting partners. we're just sort of taking the money out of the general fund of Maryland and Virginia. And I don't feel bad about that because they have a much larger resident base and a much larger tax base than we do. And these residents are doing business and like earning their income in DC, and they should be paying fairly into a city that can support everybody. So it's a really lovely, brilliant idea to reform and restructure our business taxes so that every single business that's operating in the district is paying their fair share. When businesses don't pay their fair share, a larger burden and a larger responsibility is put onto smaller businesses and local businesses to make up that difference and to have, higher corporate tax rates or payroll tax rates because these big firms aren't paying their fair share. There was a lot of talking at you. We'll send follow-up links for how to read and learn more. The other big tax idea that is being considered for this year, Ariana, if you can go back one slide, sorry, is the wealth proceeds tax. This is a way to tax the wealth and like the assets of high wealth households, not necessarily the income that they are earning in paycheck form, but passive income in the form of stocks that they hold and dividends that they're getting from those stocks, taxing the interest and the earnings that they might be getting on a savings account or a high yield account, for individuals who own multiple properties and are, operating as landlords, Airbnb-ing their place, et cetera. There's passive income that is coming into them that they are not, actively working and earning a W-2 form for, that we are not fully taxing, that we are not fully assessing. And because we are not fully assessing, where our highest wealth households have the majority of their earnings, they're not actually being asked to pay a fair share for. And so there's a couple of different ways that a wealth proceeds tax would help to target and close some loopholes on high wealth households. And this is truly like the top 8, maybe top 10% of wealthy households in the district. This is not, I don't, these are probably people that we don't necessarily know. These are very high wealth individuals that live in the city. So, we could raise a lot of money by asking our very wealthiest households to pay more of their fair share into the district and help to write that bar chart that we saw earlier, where that top 5% wasn't paying, a progressively higher share of their overall income and wealth into the district. So that's the other idea in terms of targeting both high wealth businesses and high wealth households or individuals. I said some of these things before, but just some important things to like note or reemphasize, because there are some misconceptions about these different tax ideas. The business activity tax is not intended to create an additional tax on businesses, that are already paying taxes into the district. It would be an either or kind of tax. You could pay a business activity tax, you could pay your corporate tax, potentially depending on what the rate of the business activity tax is set at. There are other taxes that could be lowered to offset revenue that's coming in, but this is not meant to be an additive tax. It is meant to be a loophole closing tax on those that are not currently paying into the district. As I was saying before, business owners that would be impacted by the BAT would be able to deduct the portion that they are paying into DC taxes from their Maryland and Virginia income tax filing. So like, again, it's meant to be like a net neutral for the individual. which I think is again like a really cool feature um, of this tax option. Um, depending, oh, and sorry, Ariana, you can skip to the next slide. Uh, depending on the way that a business activity tax is structured, there's also a possibility of capturing certain businesses like multinational corporations that do business in DC and vend to DC, like Amazon, and to get a portion of, their massive uh, economic activity as some level of tax contribution to the city. Again, by asking them to assess, a proportion of like understand the proportion of business that they are doing in the district and to pay a tax on that. So think about, again, big retailers like Amazon. I don't know who else that there is anymore in that market, but Temu or Shein or whatever these fast fashion companies are. But making sure that we are capturing all these opportunities. When it comes to the wealth proceeds tax, um, again, they're not currently paying their fair share into the city, so I don't have that much of like concern that we are, overburdening them. But that does come up as a narrative talking point of like, oh, it's, too many taxes on wealthy individuals. Well, these folks also still get loopholes, tax giveaways, tax breaks at the federal level. They also just got a whole bunch of additional tax breaks from the One Big Beautiful Bill. Some of those we tried to claw back funding for the district by not allowing those tax breaks to flow through our local tax code. We were not successful yet in doing that. But again, they're still getting big tax breaks at the federal level, which means they have more they can contribute into our local city to help shore up and strengthen our tax base. Um, and it's always worth saying that tax flight of wealthy households is a proven myth. It is not a thing that new taxes drive individuals uh, out of cities or jurisdictions. What we know does drive people out of cities or jurisdictions is displacement from people not being able to afford to live in the city that they've called home for their whole lives. And that is why we need revenue and a budget that helps to lift everybody up. Um, and I will just close presentation and open for questions by saying, some of these like proposal ideas really do help to align with both DC action values. I know under 3 has a core set of revenue proposals and values. But these revenue ideas can create more fairness in DC's tax code. They can really help to bring structural change that help to strengthen and diversify DC's tax base to meet this modern moment of uh, a post-pandemic tax world. They can really help to catalyze tax equity and racial justice, both in terms of, again, making a more progressive tax structure that asks more of our wealthiest and whitest households, but also making sure that we have the revenue available to reinvest in low-income communities, in Black and Brown communities, to lift up kids and families where they need that funding infusion. Obviously, DC Action, we support many different proposals and priorities that focus on kids and families, but there's so many other things that are needed in the city. And these are very big tax revenue ideas that could help to fund multiple priorities in the city. And so to really create the kind of caring and inclusive economy that we want to see for the city. Further, these are winnable. We've been socializing these ideas for multiple years now. There is a lot of interest and curiosity from council, from the chief financial officer, from other community stakeholders around these types of revenue principles that help to close loopholes and create more equity in our tax code. Um, and so, when we see a budget as devastating as this current one is, it creates the momentum that we need to be able to do real tax policy change, so that we can invest in the kids and families that we want to see thrive. So,